Hey guys, Mickeysaurus Reads here. I'm here with my first book review. I used to be really into reading, and that has kind of tapered off as I've gotten older and busier, but we're back now, so we're going to try to get some accountability for it by running some of these book reviews so that I can let you guys know kind of what I'm reading, hopefully we can get into a lot of what's popular, and furthermore you can know what I really like and how I feel about a lot of these books that we read. So let's just jump into it. The first book that we finished this summer was Death Takes Passage by Sue Henry. This is the fourth book in the Alex Jensen series, and fortunately you aren't really required to read any of the other books. They have it so that he is a detective, so you can read, you'll know a little bit more of his history, like the later into the books you read, and of course he's in a relationship with a beautiful Iditarod competitor named Jessie Arnold, and she plays a huge part in all of these books. So if you are going to read them, you want to read them in order, you're going to want to start with this book. Excuse me, I had to reach for it, which is Murder on the Iditarod Trail, and I am just finishing this one up, so I will get back to you about this one. But for me, Death Takes Passage was the one that was more relevant to my interests, especially at the time that I borrowed it. I do, of course, borrow as much as I can. This one comes from my local library. Read from your local library if you can. Make sure you're giving them getting them all of their borrows and everything, so that you are taking full advantage of what your government has to offer. And so that you're showing the government that libraries are important and they do matter, even to people that don't necessarily always need them, because they should be there and they should be available to everybody. So this one is rented. Death on the Iditarod Trail was rented. I shouldn't say rented, it's borrowed, because I didn't pay for it, obviously, as a library. This one is borrowed, and Death on the Iditarod Trail is borrowed, and I will, of course, be borrowing anytime I get the opportunity, which means we might be a little bit behind on what's been released, but I'm hoping to be able to get my hands on them in a reasonable amount of time. So let's start with book 4 of the Alex Jensen series, Death Takes Passage. This book was much different than I expected it to be. I'm not sure what I was expecting. I really enjoyed it for the most part. If I will preface by saying you need to be interested in not just history. You need to be interested in history, but you also need to be interested in particular in Alaskan history, which Sue Henry lived in Alaska. She did a lot of research for these books. The information in them is phenomenal. If you want to know about Alaska, read these. And I'm going to venture out and say that this is actually historical fiction at this point, because it takes place in the 90s, which I think makes it old enough to call it historical, but don't call me out if that's wrong. But it takes place in the 90s. They're fictional characters, obviously, but they are about events with histories that did actually happen. So this one follows a history of the gold rush and the Klondikes and everything that had to do with Alaskan gold rush history. So we start in Skagway and continue our way down into the Interior Passage. It's on a ferry cruise, so if you're into cruising a little bit, this is also a pretty good book. That's why I picked it up in the first place, was I was going to be on an Alaskan cruise. Obviously not the kind. This is on basically a ferry, but obviously not this kind, but I still really enjoy reading books that are relevant to what I'm doing. So this is about an Alaskan cruise. It is about the gold rush, and you will find out so much about that history, but you do need to be into it because it is going to be detailed and it is going to be thorough, but it's good. And it is interesting if you are interested in those sorts of things. It's covered in such a way that is relevant to the story. And that's that was my issue with much of the story, was that the historical information for the most part was good. She snuck some in that was a little bit off topic, or a little bit like, oh, okay, there's that random bit that we know now. But honestly, the parts that I had the most issue with on this was her descriptions of her existing characters. We had great characters, we had great story, but knowing Alex Jensen, getting to know Alex Jensen was good, and getting to know Jesse Arnold was good, but there were things about it that I felt like she kind of shoved them down our throats a little bit. There'd be paragraphs and paragraphs of description about them and kind of what they were feeling that weren't really relevant to the murder mystery at hand. Or it was not as interesting because I wasn't as invested in them. And having read a little bit of the first book already, I will tell you that is not because I didn't know them. I just wasn't interested in kind of their interactions. I was more interested in what they were doing on the ship, how they were interacting with the other characters, and what we were learning and what they were learning as the trip went on. In terms of the actual mystery part, A+. There was a lot of times, B+. There were a lot of times where I really didn't know what was going on. I like to think myself pretty good at murder mysteries. A B+ though, because a lot of it was not what you were expecting in not such a good way. So it was a good murder. It was a lot of mystery. It was really well tied into the story. Like, this story was great. But the conclusions, and I'm not going to spoil, the conclusions were not what I expected. And I wasn't that comfortable with the ending going, oh, that makes sense. A lot of it a lot of it, the kind of build up, the climax of the mystery was really good, but like kind of the bits that tied it up in the end, a lot of it was like, okay, you kind of did that because you had to. And there were a couple of open-ended bits that I guess they were answered at the end, but it was so casual and they built it up in the book that I really wanted a better ending for the smaller parts. But otherwise, like, I enjoyed it. Next time I go on a cruise, I will be reading this again. I will be reading more of her series based on how much I enjoyed this book, which I would not have continued with Death on the Iditarod Trail if I hadn't have liked Death Takes Passage. So, if you enjoy Alaska, if you enjoy murder mysteries, check out Death Takes Passage by Sue Henry. She unfortunately passed away in 2020. This is quite an old book. It was, I believe, written in the late 90s alongside its time period. But good series, excellent series, especially if you're going to be doing that traveling and you would like to be in kind of familiar territory in terms of where you are, what you're doing, and all the past information available here. So that's it. Death Takes Passage. Loved it. Would read again. 4 out of 5.